I think there's certain people, some of whom are technology vendors, who like to portray enterprise CIOs and CTOs as old sticks in the mud who never want to change anything about the environment. I think it's a much more of a dialectic. The business is sometimes pulling in a good way, sometimes pulling in the, oh, gee, we saw a billboard in an airport. So, Gen AI means we can get rid of 3,000 people. There has been a tremendous and an unfortunate amount of excitement about Gen AI's ability to write English text, which I would suggest is a parlor trick. It's like we can now use Gen AI to help people write emails. I have this dystopian image of people using Gen AI to write more and more emails to each other that nobody reads. I certainly wouldn't say that the cost of developing resilient, scalable, compliant, and secure software is going to zero. Right. The cost of developing software, if you didn't care about security, resilience, compliance, and security, was pretty low to begin with. Right. You could mock something up in a day. It just was not something you would ever allow into a production environment. Right. The question is now, do you have a change in the buy versus build considerations? My hypothesis is those providers that offer real content on business processes or business domains will do okay. And those that, in effect, are just providing workflow will do less okay.
All right, James, thanks for joining us on the Autopilot podcast. I think we're going to have a really good conversation today, specifically about enterprise adoption of AI. But before we get into all that, let's start with you and your background. Can you take a couple minutes and share what you currently do and how you got there?
Sure. How should I start from the beginning? I wound up taking a relatively random walk through my career.
Yeah. Let's start from the beginning.
Okay, yeah. People were surprised I was not a computer science major. I actually was a history major at Brown. And though I was had always been a hobbyist, I was the kid who wrote a word processor from my VIC-20 in 1983 when I was in seventh grade. I spent all my time at Brown not going to class and being editor-in-chief of the Brown Daily Herald. And then graduating into the 1992 recession, I had no idea what the hell I was going to do. So I wound up joining this little new media technology company that did a lot of work for Lotus and Spinnaker software and what have you. And I eventually wound up playing a chief technologist role there, which was sort of fun and exciting. And all sorts of cool stuff, sort of figuring out how to do graphics at, on 640 by 480 by 16 screens that would work on DOS 3.1 in 640K of memory on a 286 chip. All the stuff that kids today don't even begin to understand. After that, went to Wharton, got really excited about the telecom industry because it was around the time of the 1996 Telecom Act. Went to Deloitte for a few years, got headhunted away to McKinsey as they started their business technology practice and started to scale it. Did a couple of years working exclusively on telecom technology. Then the telecom sector imploded in 2001. I got heavily involved in a lot of the work we did around IT infrastructure for big banks. And that eventually wound up building a practice out of that. And that became the platform for my election, and spent a bunch of time scaling that practice. Eventually got interested in cybersecurity. So built that out as a practice. I did a bunch of research with the World Economic Forum and wrote a book about 10 years ago called Beyond Cybersecurity, Protecting Your Digital Business. And then since then, I helped found McKinsey's cloud practice. I'm now chief technology officer of our enterprise technology practice. I do a lot of different stuff related to enterprise technology with some big clients in banking and healthcare and in manufacturing.
We got to go back in history for a minute. I'm sure you got some interesting lessons and war stories from the .com days. Yeah, as you look back at the sort of entering the peak hype era of the .com days, what were the big mistakes that businesses were making? Not the vendors selling the technology, but the people buying the technology, the enterprises that were saying, "Oh my God, the internet's here. We've got to do something."
It's not clear to me that people made tremendous mistakes. They made lots of tactical mistakes, right? And it varied a lot by different type of company. I think there were lots of places where the IT organization wasn't aggressive enough in embracing, e-commerce and so forth. So you wound up with lots of shadow IT. Obviously, that was a mistake. I think there certainly were some institutions that, didn't embrace e-commerce and .com quickly enough. I don't know that there were too many that embraced it too quickly. Yeah, there was some money that didn't get spent with tremendous precision, but that was probably small beer in the grand scheme of things. And then there was a lot of, I would describe as absence of management rigor in enterprise technology organizations over at the time, which they spent the next 10 or 15 years addressing. I'm not sure how much of that could be avoided and how much of that was sort of a natural cycle, right? That as technology organizations got bigger and more important, it became much more critical for them to think about unit cost and, prioritization and organizational structure and operational rigor and so forth.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of like in the moment. It's like the hurricane is coming, and we've got to put some things on our windows and get out, and you can clean it up later.
Well, it's less about that. I actually I'll dispute the metaphor a little bit because a hurricane is typically a bad thing. This was a good thing,
That's true. Yeah,
right?
yeah. You just
So
found
it
oil in your
was
backyard, and you gotta get it into barrels as soon as possible.
exactly, and like 10 years from now, you're going to understand the process of drilling for oil a hell of a lot better. But in the short term, you're sort of figuring out by hook or by crook how to get oil out of the ground.
Absolutely.
And I mean, we forget how new this all is. I mean, nobody knew. I mean, it's like, I was very friendly with the one of the senior infrastructure guys from one of the big investment banks, and once I asked him, how many Unix servers they had in the early 1990s, servers, not workstation, and he thought about it for a minute, so he looked up, he started counting, he said four. I said 4,000. He said no, four. We had some mainframes and we had workstations, 92, 93, we were just figuring out what a Unix server was. So it's both astonishing and inspiring with this massive systems infrastructure surrounding us, but it all came about very, very quickly.
Yeah, it's super interesting. If you were going to draw parallels to where we are today with AI, what parallels would you draw? And I guess the follow up question to that would be: there are people screaming that this is a bubble, and I have my own views, but I don't want to pollute the water. Do you think that's true, or do you think that's false?
Yeah, I actually I was debating this with one of my colleagues at the cloud leadership forum we ran last week. We had a whole bunch of CTO, enterprise CTOs get together and debate this. And, I think there's a little bit of a history of revolutions in enterprise platforms being driven outside core IT. Like IT shops weren't the ones going and buying, PC ATs and Lotus 123 in the 1980s. And, they weren't necessarily the ones most excited about client server in the 1990s. And, they weren't always the ones most excited about e-commerce and so forth at the turn of the century. So I think there's a little bit of a question of whether the business and business unit IT and shadow IT will get out in front of enterprise IT organizations. At the same time, we live in a very different world, right? The level of risk associated with having some, sort of financial analyst running some numbers on a spreadsheet on a PC in 1988, it's a little bit smaller than integrating Gen AI into a major corporate workflow in 2025. Sort of, technology is much more pervasive and integrated into core business processes than it was 40 odd years ago.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the pull is coming from the business leaders who own the P&L. And if you see that AI can make your people more productive, right, you can generate more sales if you're using an AI tool. Or conversely, you can do something with fewer people. Like it's really, it seems natural that the people who kind of own the P&L are the ones that are pushing for the adoption versus IT sort of pushing outward.
I think it's a bit more complicated than that. I mean, I think there's Certain people, some of whom are technology vendors who like to portray enterprise CIOs and CTOs as old sticks in the mud who never want to change anything about the environment. I think it's a much more of a dialectic. The business is sometimes pulling, sometimes not, right? Yeah, which is sometimes pulling in a good way, sometimes pulling in the, oh gee, we saw a billboard in an airport, so Gen AI means we can get rid of 3,000 people.
We flew into SFO and it said we'll save $1 billion. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, there's many CIOs I know who don't think CEOs should be, when they go through airports, should be forced to wear blinders so they can't see the billboards on either side of the concourse, right? The SFO is worse than most, right? But LaGuardia has got plenty of those billboards also. So it varies. It's all over the place. Sometimes you have IT passionate about new technologies, and the business is reluctant. Oftentimes, let's face it, IT budgets are not unlimited. Doing things at scale in a resilient way, in a secure way, in a way that's compliant with regulations is not cheap, so budgets are always tight. So some of it's driven by the fact that the business has the budget, right? And IT has less discretionary budget it can apply to new technologies.
Yeah. This is like one of the major disconnects I think I see with a lot of early stage AI startups where you have like great founders who are super technical, who were researchers at DeepMind or whatever, and have decided to attack this narrow problem set. They often don't realize what it actually takes to sell to an enterprise and like all the boring stuff. Like you need single sign on.
And it's much harder now than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah, you need single sign on, and you need GDPR compliance or HIPAA compliance and SOC 2.
And here's the 6-month process for getting certified by our security organization. And procurement doesn't want to add another new vendor
Exactly.
onto the approved vendor list. Like 20 years ago, stuff was just wild. They put anything into an enterprise environment. Now it's much more restricted. I do think, VCs such as yourself play an important role because in many cases they have relationships with some big institutions and they can sort of, they understand the pathway in a way that, sort of a startup that did not have access to that type of counsel would not.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of a few ways that VCs can actually add value versus detract.
It's a very, customer number one is tremendously important value, right?
100%.
Do you want me to come back to the issue of whether I think Gen AI is a bubble?
Yeah, that'd be great.
I do not, but I think everyone's thinking about it incorrectly
Okay.
and where the value lies. So I think there has been a tremendous and an unfortunate amount of excitement about Gen AI's ability to write English text, which I would suggest is a parlor trick. It's like we can now use Gen AI to help people write emails. I don't know about you, but I get more emails than I want in any given day. So I have this dystopian image of people using Gen AI to write emails, more and more emails to each other that nobody reads.
One model's writing, the other model's reading, and trying to summarize.
Yeah, there's exactly.
Yeah.
So the last thing the world needs is more emails, more low quality marketing text, more marketing collateral, what have you. Now, I still think Gen AI is incredibly important for a couple of reasons. It's as much about the interrogative aspect of Gen AI than about the generative aspect. Although interrogation does lead to generation. Here's what I mean by that. Most institutions are sitting on top of an endless ocean of unstructured text, excuse me, procurement contracts. If you're a bank, ISDAs, business cases, semi-structured data also like tickets, Jira logs, what have you. And most institutions only analyze a tiny fraction of this data because it's expensive, right? There's only it's expensive and time consuming to have somebody sit down and go through 300 IT business cases to figure out what the patterns are and where you have not invested money in automating business processes, even though it's a really interesting thing. But through RAG, we can now interrogate those business cases and generate summary data, metadata that we can put into, some form of database and then analyze it, which to me is phenomenal value. And for example, McKinsey, we're already starting to do that with procurement contracts. And even the simplest things can be really interesting. Like, okay, what are the vendor contracts you've signed where you've agreed to net 30 days payment terms versus net 60 days versus net 90 days? Well, why did you agree to net 30 days over here and net 60 days over there? And, can we reconcile invoices against contracts to make sure that we're getting, pricing that accords with the best possible pricing implied by the contracts you signed? Because I promise you, having done the analysis manually any number of times, it's very tough to make sure that you're getting the pricing that you deserve or pricing that you deserve. And they head in the other direction. There's lots of times where there's, sort of, for customer contracts where there's payment for additional services or what have you that you're entitled to having signed the contract. It's just nobody's ever watched the contracts closely enough to make sure you get all of those. And multiply that by 1,000 and think about all the data you can start to extract insight from and apply to your institution.
It's a really, really interesting insight. How is that currently done? Like in terms of contract reconciliation, is that just done by an analyst on the procurement or billing team? Is it done? Is it outsourced?
You got it, or you either have someone on the procurement or billing team, or if you're hire a consultancy to go do a procurement study, someone will say, okay, gee, you know, get me, or historically, we've now advanced beyond this in the past year, but, get me a sample of your past, 100 contracts, and we're going to have, some poor slob of a recent business school graduate sit down and read the damn contracts, right? And, now we're starting to realize that, hey, we can accelerate that process. And let me tell you something, the 25-year-old business school graduate appreciates being able to spend more time thinking and doing analysis rather than reading 100 contracts.
I was just talking to someone who runs one of the big law firms that you've probably heard of. He was explaining how this is like one of the most painful things that their associates do. It's like, all right, take this 80-page contract and summarize it into 3 pages so that it's digestible and understanding.
Yeah, I will say there is part of me that thinks we are coming at, this legal issue all backwards because of, coordination costs. So my wife used to negotiate commercial real estate leases. Now there's only so many provisions in a commercial real estate lease that make up, say, 80-90% of the provisions. You have the HVAC, you have lobby access, what have you. How come nobody's ever come up with like an XML standard for commercial leasing? I mean, they do it for mortgage. When people trade mortgages, there is a standard contract, right? But how come, it is disappointing to me that we've never come up with as a society, we've never come up with the XML standard for certain types of contracts. Because when you think about it, and I love the English language and I love to write and what have you, but it's a tremendously imprecise instrument for conveying information compared to JSON or XML or what have you, right? How come we're using the English language to communicate these incredibly precise things?
Well, I think that's the paradigm of the entire legal industry. It's based on complexity and inefficiency. right? The incentive is to make everything more complex and require more human labor.
At some point, somebody might have disrupted, and there's lots of things outside the legal industry. How come we write business cases in a word processor? How come there's no standard format for for an IT business case? You would think somebody would have come up with that.
I agree. Yeah, it seems logical, but maybe AI will be the thing that gets us
Well,
there.
I mean, what's interesting is Gen AI may be the second best thing because we're going to take a textual business case or a textual contract, interrogate it to turn it into structured data, and then store the structured data. That clearly will happen. Right? There's just too much value for that not to happen. That at some point will people start to say, gee, every contract we write, we convert to this format. Would there not be less error in constructing in that format to begin with? Now that I'm sure would freak out all sorts of lawyers and other people who, are sure their creativity is important, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting insight, though. I want to go back to the problem set you just talked about a second ago, and I think it's related to this as well. The problem you're basically describing is like if you're a business, you have most of your data is probably unstructured. A lot of it's text data, and it's sitting in all these different repositories.
Unless you were born online. That is, I think, one of the advantages for the big companies that were born online. So much of their data is structured, so they have so much more telemetry inlet into their business processes and their customer relationships, so they can do things analytically that no one else can.
Sure, that makes sense. But assuming you're most businesses, which were not born online, and you have all this unstructured data, and it sounds like you guys are already doing this internally. Like, how do you go about taking all of that data and making it, searchable and building that layer?
Well, I mean, like everybody, there's nobody who's, the planet Earth is sort of not even at the plate yet. We're sort of walking out of the on deck circle, right? So that it's a question of who's a few feet further out of the on deck circle versus others. Here is so I don't have a definitive answer. I have a set of hypotheses here. So I think ontology will be very important. And I did a LinkedIn post where I said the future is ontological, right? So I think that a lot of the IP of many institutions will be in ontologies, whether it's a bank with their ontology for banking products, or a healthcare provider with a disease ontology, which is much tougher. Healthcare providers tell me than banking ontologies because there's so much more judgment required to figure out if you have one set of symptoms versus another set of symptoms. I think knowledge graphs will be incredibly important because you instantiate the ontology in a knowledge graph and start to use RAG to populate the knowledge graph, and then you can derive inferences from the knowledge graph. Also, I would suggest it's a hell of a lot quicker and cheaper to query a knowledge graph than to query a large language model, right? And then I think it's going to be a lot of one step at a time. Okay, let's look at our you know raw materials contracts, right? Let's look at our mid-market customer contracts. Let's look at our IT business cases, and you're just gonna, people are gonna go domain by domain, and then hopefully you can start to federate different types of data sets, and that is one of the things that I find intriguing about knowledge graphs. You can start to federate them, so you could start to link. Okay, if you know what your requirements are, your commitments are to customers, do your customer contracts, and you know what your commitments are from your vendors via vendor contracts, then can you think about your supply chain and your value chain in a much more integrated way and start to think about, okay, how do we start to align, pricing and inventory so we can, or, in order to get the most value from inventory we have, right? And to drive down inventory, for example, to the lowest safe level. Does that answer your
Makes a
question?
lot of sense. Yeah, and I agree. I'll probably start with the low hanging fruit use cases and then expand from there.
Yeah, and they'll be it'll be a bit of an ink blot type strategy where different domains doing different things and experimenting and then hopefully starting to link together.
If I put my investor hat on for a second, there's this question for this use case and for many use cases in the enterprise. Who's going to win, a startup or the incumbents? And I think in this use case specifically, you have the incumbents who are already the systems of record for this data in many cases, and logically they would win. But on the startup side, I invested in a startup that's attacking this use case called Humata at my prior firm, and they'll get mad if I share their metrics, but they're one of the fastest growing companies I think in history, millions and millions of users. And so you've got startups that are growing like nothing we've ever seen, and then you have the incumbents that are the logical winners here with the systems of record and distribution. How do you think this is going to shake out?
I'll note that I'm not a investment advisor and don't provide investment advice before I give a intergalactically uninsightful answer and say it's going to be a mix, right? I mean, if we looked at every previous transition in the enterprise technology world, some incumbents do just fine. Some attackers do great. Some attackers get bought by incumbents and do even better. Some attackers get bought by incumbents and it doesn't work out so well and wind up getting destroyed. The one thing I will say is I think it's a scary moment for enterprise SaaS providers. So if we think about, okay, if we believe the application of Gen AI to development and the ability to generate code, for the first time, certainly since the offshoring disruption, we're going to see a reduction in the unit cost of development. And you can even argue whether that was, offshoring was really a reduction in the unit cost of development or just a reduction in the unit cost of maintenance and operations, right? So the question to me is, does that change buy versus build considerations? And I'll use an example from something I had to do this morning. There's some tool that McKinsey uses that's a enterprise SaaS product. I won't say for what, but it is the most confusing. I needed to do something very simple, which required paging through like 12 screens and scrolling through 8 sections and finding exactly the thing I needed to do. Right. And then, getting not eight, 3 error messages saying, oh, you didn't update this field also. Right. It was probably the best possible commercially available tool for this capability. And at the same time, and a terrible user experience and a rational choice on our internal IT functions part because it wouldn't have made sense for them to go build this themselves. The question is, in a world where the unit cost of functionality goes down, rather than provide a terrible customer experience because you're buying something that's a process that doesn't quite fit what you need, you just develop it yourself, right?
Yeah, the cost to develop software is approaching zero.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I certainly wouldn't say that the cost of developing resilient, scalable, compliant, and secure software is going to zero, right? The cost of developing software, if you didn't care about security, resilience, compliance, and security, was pretty low to begin with, right? You could mock something up in a day. It just was not something you would ever allow into a production environment, right? The question is now, do you have a change in the buy versus build considerations? My hypothesis is those providers that offer real content, business processes or business domains, will do okay, and those that in effect are just providing workflow will do less okay.
If you think about like the surface area of SaaS tools in a company, and this is double clicking on the thing you just said at the end there, you know, I guess there are many ways you could sort of bifurcate the universe of software companies. You could say lightweight applications, core systems of record, however you want to break this down. Which categories do you think are most vulnerable to this new buy versus build paradigm, and which do you think are pretty safe?
I suspect the closer you are to core transactional, the harder it will be to disrupt. Switching costs are higher, risks are higher. Some of those have some real business process content built into the thing. I think it'll be more the lighter weight applications where in effect you're buying UI and workflow, right? Rather than, anything especially sophisticated. And then you might say, okay, gee, we can have a couple of our developers knock this out in a few weeks and it'll be much more fit for purpose.
Do you think organizations will develop these tools, like build them internally, or do you think they'll hire third-party consultants to come in and build these tools?
As always, it'll be a mix. I mean, I will say, broadly speaking, we see more companies repatriating. I think there, I mean, back around 2007, 2010, it was like, hey, we don't want anyone touching the keyboard. We don't want that person working for us. We want project managers working for us. And I've certainly over the past 5, 7, 8 years, we've seen a reversal of that trend where people have realized it's important to have core technical talent inside of the four walls of the institution, both because there's real domain knowledge and because it's hard. The more you move to an agile type model and the more quickly you seek to move, it's harder to write a contract. If you have all your requirements specified and you're pretty comfortable about that, you can write a contract around that in fairly straightforward fashion. There's more complexity around writing a contract for a highly dynamic environment. You know, the more interesting question to me is how does the shape of the engineering talent pool evolve, whether it's internal or external? And there's been a lot of debate and some studies recently around whether Gen AI based developer support tools, for want of a better term, more improve the productivity of experienced versus inexperienced programmers. And to date, there's been, I think, some evidence that there's been more positive impact for inexperienced programmers. I wonder, and this is a hypothesis, not a fact, if that is a artifact of a point in time, us being at a point in time where the tools are still relatively nascent. We don't quite know how to use them. So you're getting some value from, you know, newbie engineer being able to go to some tool and say, oh, gee, how do I do X, Y, and Z? And that person gets some sample code. Right, which is great, which is fantastic.
It's like replacing Stack Overflow for a junior developer.
Yeah, exactly. It's a much better, yeah, yes. Now, there's an alternative model. It's what I call an artisanal model where you have a master engineer who is thinking through the architecture, and rather than dispensing tasks to a more junior developer, that person could dispense tasks to an agent and get them done immediately rather than waiting weeks. Now, that's still unproven, but the metaphor, now that I have this beach house up in Rhode Island, I set up a workshop in the garage. It's awesome. I have a miter saw and a table saw and what have you. And I call this the sort of table saw model of engineering, right? So you have some idiot like me who barely knows how to use a table saw who actually, I could do some stuff with it. But if you watch the videos on YouTube of these master woodworkers, they can do magic, right? The table saw and a couple other and a router and a mic saw allow them to do 10,000 times what I could do.
Sure.
And so I wonder to what extent, Gen AI enabled development tools will, empower this class of artisans that will be able to do phenomenal things when you put together sophisticated tooling with their experience and skill set.
I think that's the way it's going to play out. I agree with that. I also think we're going to see the rise of kind of semi-technical product managers who can now build lightweight software products without writing any code. I don't know if you've seen this tool called Replit AI Agent.
I've heard of it. I haven't seen it in detail.
Yeah, I was playing around with it the other day, And there's a Twitter post going around about a university system that paid $1 billion for like a course management software. And
Yeah, fair. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, it was, everybody's like, this is absurd. And I was like, I wonder how long it would take me to build this with Replit AI agent. And it took me like 30 minutes. And maybe, it doesn't have scalability and all that. But it's interesting. I actually tried to get it to create some workarounds on like the login system, and it wouldn't allow me to do it because it considered it to be an insecure practice. But the point is, I could build a lightweight version of this $1 billion software product in 30 minutes without writing a single line of software code, which is insane. And I think that's
Yeah, now the question is, to me, okay, let's take the canonical $1 billion software project. What should that, without commenting about any particular software project, what should that have cost with just bare competence, with just basic competence, without any advanced access to Gen AI tools? Is it $1 million? Is it $10 million? Is it $100,000? Right. So there's some part of me that says, gee, it probably could be a lot less than $1 billion just with basic managerial competence. And then the other question is, there's two hypotheses you could have. One is that a dysfunctional organization can screw anything up and make it cost an infinitely large amount, no matter what tooling is available. Or you reach a point where something is so quick is that somebody says, "Oh, gee, why are you planning to spend 2 years? I dummied this up in an afternoon," right? And it becomes a mechanism for making the case that the proverbial $1 billion software project doesn't make sense.
yep, yeah, I agree. And of course, there's more complexity behind the scenes, right? And so it's a kind of a crazy example, but I think this concept of
It's still an interesting one.
it's still an interesting one. And this concept of anybody with an internet connection being able to create software without writing a single line of code is really interesting. And I think will have implications 5 to 10 years from now that are hard to predict.
Yeah. Yeah, I will say I was skeptical when I first started reading about this. I was very skeptical, and because there's things like, oh, gee, you can generate code using a Gen AI tool, but you have to be very, very precise in the prompt you ask for and specific and what have you. I'm like, gee, if only we had this type of language that forced you to be very precise in telling a computer what to do. But it
We can explicitly say this. Yeah.
but it seems to work. Yeah. The other thing I would note, and this was a conversation that came up at the Cloud Leadership Forum last week, we got into an interesting discussion about who your best engineers would be. And one of the folks there said that his best engineers derive from two factors: one, intrinsic skill, problem solving skill, and deep insight into his environment, because there was a ton of legacy and this was connected to that and this system was dependent on that other system and they built it some crazy way in 1997. You can imagine, right? And then he made the points that he thought, and all of which was poorly documented. And he made the point that the ability of generative AI to interrogate legacy code and legacy configuration for younger engineers who might be very talented would allow very talented younger engineers to get down the experience curve more quickly. And the person with killer problem solving skills, relatively speaking, might become more valuable than someone with 15 years of experience in the environment, but weaker problem solving skills, which I thought was really interesting.
That is very interesting. Yeah, it's crazy how arcane some of these systems are and poorly documented. I remember, I'm sure you come across this probably several times a day, but remember years ago I had a startup and we were selling to a bank, and I won't name the bank, but a big bank, and they had 86 different identity stores that didn't talk to each other, and the behavior of the system was such that like it would reject an authentication event, and nobody knew why. There wasn't a single person in the entire bank that knew what was happening and why the system was behaving this way.
one bank, they had a problem with a payment transaction, and they had, like 140 people on the resolution phone call because it just transacted that many systems. Everyone's like, "Is it a network thing? Is it database timeout? Is it the front?" And they're trying to trace the transaction through the time. It turned out that somebody made a configuration change to an LPAR in London, for some system that this payment transaction depended on, but it wasn't documented. But it took 4 days of massive phone calls before someone said, "Oh, gee, why don't we ask these guys in London? Maybe they'll know." Right. And
So yeah, having AI to just to document everything in your system and interrogate it and help you get a better understanding of behaviors and why things happen, I think is a really interesting use case. I'm curious. This is
which is, again, goes to my point about taking unstructured, semi-structured, or poorly structured data and pulling it into something. Now, the question is, I have not been excited by telling Gen AI tools to summarize this for me. Sometimes it can be fine, but you really don't know what it's summarizing, what it's leaving out. But is there an ontology you could create for your business processes that would allow you to interrogate or write a prompt to interrogate various code bases and configurations so you could understand the process flow in a structured way? Does that make sense?
makes total sense.
Which again brings us back to the importance of ontology.
Yep, that makes complete sense. You're seeding startup ideas now. I do have one more question on the AI side. Where do you think we are in the adoption cycle? It seems like every organization is.
I already told you we're sort of like the guy's taking the donut off the bat and sort of walking out of the on deck circle towards the plate, if that slowly.
I guess to double click on that, like, are you seeing enterprises move from like experimentation pilots into scaled up production, or do you think everything is still in experimentation?
I haven't said very few. Most people are at most people at the pilot stage.
That makes sense. So still super early in the cycle. And what do you think
Yeah,
is
and doing all that, and again, I keep saying scalable, resilient, secure, compliant. Doing all that at the now, actually, I'll just take that back. I think there's some analytics use cases where people in production, because analytics is a little bit easier, right? If it's non-transactional and you're just interrogating a data set for insights, then you have fewer. You can move more quickly than you can with a transactional process.
that makes sense? And I guess the final question to tack onto that related to AI, when you look at kind of the barriers to adoption, is it just purely like the all the enterprise stuff that you just described, or are people still trying to figure out whether or not there's actually value in these tools?
Well, it's more, I would describe, where is the value than whether there's value, right? And like there's lots of hype, like is a chatbot really the value versus something else, right? Funding, and related to that, funding's always tough, right? Because the beta on any of these projects is high. So you have a business case process that's more attuned towards low risk investments. It's a combination of massive uncertainty about where the value is and processes that are more attuned towards low beta rather than high beta, or low risk rather than high risk investments. All the stuff around security, resiliency, compliance, and scalability, a dearth of the relevant skill sets. And let's face it, most large enterprises are not, and most large enterprise IT organizations are not designed to move at incredible speed.
Yep, that all makes sense. One more question for you. So you've obviously had an incredible career and ended up in a place where I think a lot of people would love to end up. If you go back to day one of your career, you just graduated with a history degree, and you're looking at the next 30 years. Knowing everything you know now, what advice would you have given yourself?
I would, here's the advice I would give myself: to realize the interplay between the subjective and the objective, So I'm a real fact-based person. I like facts. I'm very analytical. And I would say early in my career, I didn't realize how important it was to understand motivation, understand barriers, understand how to enlist people for the things that I was analytically sure was right. So the question is, how can you be very analytical about the emotional?
That's excellent advice. I wholeheartedly agree.
So this was a blast.
This was awesome. Yeah, man, really appreciate you joining.
Thanks for tuning in to the Autopilot podcast. If you're using AI to create or disrupt a large industry, I would love to learn more about your story. Drop me a line on Twitter or go to our website, apv.vc. If you want to support the show, the best ways are to leave a review wherever you're listening and subscribe. The Autopilot podcast is part of Turpentine, the podcast network behind Moment of Zen, Turpentine VC, Age of Miracles, and more shows for experts by experts in tech.
Hey everyone, Eric here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at ericaturpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.